Hi, we continue in 1 Samuel 25 today as we begin to encounter the fascinating character of Abigail, who, not in this video but in the next one, will give the longest speech by a woman anywhere in the Bible. And as you can see on the right side of the screen, I'd like to start by noting how in this chapter, which we've already seen echoes the chapters around it in 1 Samuel 24 and 26, and also echoes many aspects of the Jacob and Laban story, and also echoes earlier parts of 1 Samuel, which isn't surprising because the whole story echoes back and forth. Here we have Abigail, who echoes many characters, both in this story and in Genesis, as you can see. Two characters there. So let's look at that first before we look at our story and situate this in the context we've been looking at. So as we noted earlier, she's introduced as beautiful, and she was introduced in the first few verses, but then she wasn't in the story until right now. So we know she's beautiful like Rachel and David. We'll see in this scene, and you can see on the left side of the screen in verse 18 the provision there, her in hurrying to provide hospitality to strangers like Rebekah does for Abraham's servant in Genesis. She's an intimate of the master who sides with David like Jonathan, and I could have also put up like Michal there as well. And that's also part of the overall structure here that suggests that Nabal is a stand-in for Saul, whether from the narrator's perspective or in chapter 26 where in Saul having a dream, if this is his dream imagination where Nabal is an embodiment of himself. We also note that since Samuel is named as having died in the very first verse of this chapter, out of context of everything else going on, that in the next scene we'll see she's also a voice of Yahweh to David, and we'll look at the key word element of that in a moment. And then finally, anticipating what will come later, she's taken by David from her husband. And although in the Bathsheba situation we know unquestionably that it's a theft from Uriah who ends up dead, it's a little more ambiguous here about how she gets to be David's wife, but that'll be at the very end of the chapter as we'll see. So, continuing to situate it in our context here, we note these verbal links with the story of Jacob and Esau. So, here we were last time with the 400 men, but now we have this grand present. So the present that she offers here and the one that Jacob did. In both cases, there's an element of offering it to someone you're afraid might respond with violence otherwise. Jacob's false fear that Esau, his brother, would carry the hatred he had with him from the time when they were younger, when the blessing was stolen, and Abigail, perhaps, although we'll see it's ambiguous, given the threat of David as a stranger, although she certainly doesn't know about the all your men strap on your swords. She simply knows that the offer that was relayed from her servants, from David's servants. And then we'll also see here in verse 19 something, as one scholar notes, as we'll see, has no reason here other than to echo the Jacob story, the go on ahead of me, just as Jacob says go on ahead of me there. And then we'll also see David today in his defense justifying that he had cared for the master's sheep. And this is only in private conversation, either in David's mind or some other way, because it's not clear who it's said to. And similarly here, Jacob says to Laban, out of his whole experience, these 20 years I've been with you and not caused any harm. So certainly parallels there. We also see the parallels with the surrounding chapters. So here we are where David, again in that same soliloquy, notes about Nabal has returned me evil for good, as Saul says the opposite to David. You David, have repaid me, Saul, with good, and I have repaid you with evil. And then we're going to see an interesting element here, only at the very end, and this is a spoiler giveaway, where the New RSV has leave one male, but the literal means one who pisses against the wall, and we'll look at that in a little bit of detail later. But interestingly paralleled in the beginning of chapter 24 with Saul going to relieve himself. So men relieving themselves in both situations there. I was noting that the key word for Abigail will be in the next scene, where she brings up Yahweh all the time here, and also your servant over and over again. But in our scene right here, there really are no keywords. This is a little bit of a transitional passage between where we were in the last one with the proposal that's rejected and Abigail's response. So as we left the story, her servants boldly saying to their mistress, know this and see what you should do, although they don't say what she should do. And what she does, of course, is to provide this enormous gift. And we'll look at the gift more in a minute. But let's consider her motivations here. As we noted around David, there were three possible motivations for David's offer to Nabal. Either that it's a godfather-like thing, making an offer he can't refuse, hidden behind the gentle entreaty of the young men, and as verified perhaps by the strapping on of swords when it's refused, but it could also have been a bill for services due, that he had provided these services as Nabal's own servants verified, and now wants to be paid for them. And finally, it could have been a patron-client relationship initiation, as some noted in the triple introduction of Shalom, 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 fitting a diplomatic entreaty, which Nabal also rejects. So just as David had three motives in a chapter that's full of express triplets, Abigail potentially has three motives too, and depending upon readers, we can hear it one of several ways. Either she's really glad to see David and she's providing this, hoping that this gift might lead her to become his wife instead of the fool, ill-natured fool that she has. Or it could be she's afraid of David and recognizing, my husband's a fool because he doesn't recognize the threat that's going on, and we'll all be dead unless I do something here. Or is it perhaps something else? Perhaps Abigail has another reason which will only emerge as we go. So the hurrying here is clearly a connection with both Abraham and Sarah hurrying to provide hospitality for the three strangers in chapter 18 in Genesis, and for Rebekah when Abraham's servant is looking for someone of that same ilk when she hurries to water all of the 10 camels. So Abigail is hurrying here, but again, is it hurrying out of hospitality or is it hurrying out of fear? The list of what she provides is extensive, and we can compare that with other loads of food as gifts in Samuel. And very explicitly, this one is very closely connected to here in 2 Samuel 16, and we can see the connection around the 200 loaves, the 100 bunches of raisins, and the skin of wine, although they're not identical. The ones that are underlined here are the ones that are unique in these scenes, and the ones that are color-coded, obviously, are the ones that are in common. So we see, not surprisingly, that bread is the most common thing in various forms. Although earlier, we see here when Samuel sent Saul to find these men, they just say we have 3 loaves. And we hear loaves, we're thinking like a pita loaf, not like what you might think of a raised loaf of bread, but basically 3 pieces of bread. Here, when Jesse sent a donkey to basically give David to Saul the king, it's just generically with bread, a single skin of wine, and a kid. And when Jesse sends David for his brothers, he sends a little more, an ephah of parched grain, 10 loaves, and 10 cheeses. But that's also the 10 cheeses are for the commander to be in good favor there. So skipping some of the others, we'll see here to get this Egyptian who's been in the midst of a war scene here, and this is when Saul and Jonathan will be declared dead, who's simply hungry at the moment, and they give him bread to eat. But they also give him this piece of fig cake and 2 clusters of raisins, which is certainly not necessary. Once he has water and bread, that's enough. So there's something, a little sweetness and extra there, as we see here as well. In this one, Ziba, the servant of Mephibosheth, who's one of Saul's descendants, precisely the people at the end of chapter 24 that Saul had David swear before him that he would not cut off. That's exactly what he's afraid of here, and he brings, like Abigail, 200 loaves of bread, 100 bunches of raisins, etc., plainly in a situation of fear of retaliation if he doesn't placate him. So that certainly gives some basis for thinking that Abigail is in a similar situation there. And then finally here, not quite at the end, but after the situation of the Absalom rebellion here, while they're still hungry, there's all these provisions provided. And this is plainly for the troops who are hungry and weary and thirsty in the wilderness. So it's not a matter of hospitality, it's simply a matter of survival there. So the ones that are the closest, plainly, is this one in 2 Samuel 16 and the one we have here, highlighting the issue of whether this is provided for fear. And as feminist scholars have said, Abigail is a woman in the face of David and his men, which she doesn't know are coming, but she'll discover in a couple of verses, is an incredibly vulnerable situation, both physically and sexually. What would she do if this band of misfits that David has around him decided that she was part of the prize in addition to the food and other things she provides? There's something we certainly need to be aware of there, although in the incident that's not quite exactly what happens, maybe. So we don't need to look at each of these things otherwise, except to note a couple of interesting details hidden behind the translation, and I'll bring the key words up so we can see the whole chapter there. The phrase 2 skins of wine involves the phrase nival yayin, which is skins of wine, but the word for skin is a play on Nabal. It literally is almost the same exact word. So it could be 2 of Nabal's wine, although the skin of wine is the normal thing because that's what it comes in. But Nabal will be filled with his wine at the end, so that would not be off at all to say 2 skins of wine or foolish wine, one way or another. We certainly hear that. 5 sheep ready dressed, which is just curious because it's a doubling here of the verb for made. So yes, made sheep. Parched grain, quali, which echoes, as I've noted, the parched grain provided in the Goliath context and the ones we see elsewhere, and only in those places elsewhere in the Deuteronomistic history. But in these two other places, in the Nephal stem, here it's in the qual stem, the basic stem, and there it can mean to be lightly esteemed or dishonored, according to the BDV lexicon. So perhaps there's another play there. In addition to the play on Nabal wine here, perhaps there's also a play that the audience could hear of dishonored grain, echoing that it's Nabal's grain. The 100 clusters of raisins here, again, only these two places here in chapter 30 there, in the entire Masoretic text other than the reference in 1 Chronicles. And then she loaded them on donkeys here, as Jesse did in 1620. So that's quite a lot, and we don't hear a word from her. We don't hear what her strategy is, and yet we hear what she says here, which is the first clue we have of what's going on. So she said to her young men, as opposed to Nabal's young men, and certainly as opposed to David's young men, go on ahead of me. And as Biddle notes below, as I was suggesting, since the sending ahead motif plays no explicit or plausible implicit role in 1 Samuel 25, it seems likely that its sole function is to allude to the Jacob-Esau encounter, as I was noting. But she did not tell her husband or her man Nabal, so she's not communicating with him at all. Why would that be? Because he's simply a fool, or because she thinks he wouldn't approve? He certainly wouldn't approve. He said, "Who is David? Who is the son of Jesse? I'm not giving my stuff to someone I don't know." So she's plainly going around him. The first indication that she's either siding with David or she understands the threat of David in a way that her husband didn't. And so now we have this interesting scene echoing earlier scenes here, coming down the mountain. But one of the questions of coming down the mountain is which mountain? As we've seen, their home is in Maon, but the sheep are in Carmel. And from this image from Google Maps, you can see there's really not much of a mountain in that area. There's certainly Mount Carmel, but Mount Carmel is far to the west of that and not in this immediate area. So the mountain seems to be just a function of the story, or maybe a function of Saul's dream, where he's recalling previous stories of going round opposite sides of the mountain. As we saw in 23:26, we can go back to that and see Saul on one side of the mountain and David and his men on the other. That's not quite in our summary within 24 and 26, but as we already noted, there were also echoes from the end of chapter 23. So perhaps that one side of the mountain is simply one other link, although I didn't put it on the chart because I was trying to link it simply with echoes in chapter 24 and 26. So she's coming down under cover of the mountain, or hiding. Who is she hiding from? Is she hiding from Nabal, or is she hiding from David? She certainly doesn't know that what we're about to see, which is that David is coming down the mountain as well. She has no idea where she is as far as we know. But here he comes, and as always, the NORSV omits the behold here. Vahenna, David and his men came toward her, much like Esau coming toward Jacob, and Jacob was terrified, but Esau had come in peace. And David, as we know, already has his sword strapped on and his 400 men, not counting the 200 he left behind with their things. So this is her first perception of David, 400 men with swords coming at her down the mountain. And then the writer does an interesting thing. It does a little flashback, and as Borga notes below, the flashback provides a perfect contrast to Abigail's demeanor. And I note that narrator's omniscient perspective, because we don't know who this is being spoken to or when or exactly where, sometime apparently after they're strapping on their sword when they're on their way down the mountain here. But what many have noted is what David says here reveals something that we otherwise may have suspected but haven't seen, which is David's intention to murder, whether that's Saul or Nabal's men or otherwise. It's now being revealed in this story, again, whether it's Saul's dream or otherwise. So he had said, surely it was in vain, or using shakur, and the only other time it's used is treacherously. So that wouldn't fit here, so the translators offer in vain, but it's certainly a strong word. That I protected all this fellow, all that he had and all that belonged to him, and repeated here in the second verse here. And also, as my note below suggests, creating a sarcastic contrast. Nothing was missing from all Nabal possessed, so David now is threatened to take away all he possessed, especially his men who belonged to him. He uses the pejorative "zeh" for this fellow, which is the first time David has spoken to him, but of course everybody else has been speaking badly of Nabal, so why shouldn't he? His name means fool, and as we saw, he's a son of Belial, one of the strongest insults known in the Bible. So David is joining the company of people bad-mouthing Nabal. But notice what he's saying, all this fellow has in the wilderness, which is to say the sheep and the goats, not any other property he has at the home in Maon. Nothing was missing, again, repeating what we heard earlier. But he's returned me evil for good, echoing, as we saw, Saul in chapter 24. So he continues here with the phrase we need to look at here. And my note below highlights what I was just saying, expressing his desire to kill. God, do so to David and more also, if by morning I leave so much as one male of all who belong to him. We need to look in some detail there. So, as Ellen von Wolde notes, he justifies his plan by his view of the past, and he legitimizes by trapping God in his conditional way of thinking, which is to say, making God do to him something if he doesn't kill all these people. And yet, is God really a part of that? Notice Elohim here, not Yahweh, as Abigail will consistently offer as Yahweh. If by morning here, Ad Haboker, playing on Bakir the wall, which they said that they were a protection against. And now we get to this fun phrase, one male who belongs to him, which is Mastin Bakir, those who piss against the wall. And plainly the New RSV, as many other older translations, are embarrassed by that graphic description, but the audience is certainly not, and the Bible is certainly not. And as many scholars have noted, there's nothing understood by that as pejorative just in itself. It's just simply a description of males, but there is a little more. As Van Wolde notes here, David refers to the extinction of this house as if it were a royal house. And that highlights the fact that in almost all these other uses, notice they're all in the Deuteronomistic history, it refers to the cutting off of somebody's seed, of their descendants. Let's just look at a random example here. I will bring disaster on you, I'll consume you, and cut off from Ahab every male, bond or free in Israel, and I will make your house like the house of Jeroboam. And if we looked at the others, they're the same thing. So what's at issue there is cutting off the progeny. Ironically, exactly what Saul asked David to promise. Let's look at it. Saul says, swear to me by Yahweh, you will not cut off my descendants after me, you will not wipe out my name from my father's house. And David swears, and that's exactly what he's promising to do to Nabal here. So we can say, well, he's not breaking his promise, because he didn't make the promise to Nabal, but to the extent that we as readers know that Nabal is a stand-in for Saul, certainly that's what's being expressed here. And I want to go down in my note a little farther to note Smith, who wrote an entire article on this phrase, analyzes it, and finds that the term Mishkan derives from the word for urinate, but he notes, quote, the most common understanding as the source of an implied metaphor with dog as a first implied target, which is that dogs piss against the wall, taken pejoratively to refer to a man as the second implied target. So from that perspective, he says the modern equivalent would be SOB, except the C for cur would perhaps replace the B. But he questions that and rejects another view that simply sees it as guard dogs for no support. He instead suggests using a Syrian dream text, and I ask whether that's really relevant to our audience. Maybe it is, maybe it's not. That a wall pisser is a man who seeks progeny, and the threat of destruction interrupts that. And whether that's true from the Assyrian text or not, whether those are relevant to the authors of the story, it certainly seemed to represent their progeny. That urine and semen are being equated here, that liquid coming out of the end of the penis is a symbolic expression of future children, and that's what he's saying, that I'll cut off your seed. And so hidden behind his threat to Nabal is the threat to Saul that has been throughout chapters 24 and 26, answering the question, how will David succeed Saul? Will it be by his violence, or will Yahweh strike him down, or will he die of old age? And this is the first time we see that David has this desire of violence. And we can't forget that, because throughout the rest of 1 Samuel, and especially in 2 Samuel, David will manage to keep some at least plausible deniability behind violence to his enemies that happen all around him, but which he never does directly. So we'll continue with our story next time as Abigail greets David and enters into the longest speech by a woman anywhere in the Bible. See you for that next time. Bye-bye.